Uh, Shubho Sandhya. Uh, uh, Today we got basically someone with us actually to give a lecture on decoloniality, postcolonialism, and Southern epistemology actually. And her name is Joanna Manboran, and she's an educator, researcher, and cultural organizer. And she focuses on the multidisciplinary aspect actually in her works, especially focus on art, museum, and other aspect of it, and it in connection with the decoloniality and Southern epistemology. And she's peer reviewer and also part of the editorial team in number of journals. So today she's going to talk about actually that center staging the South and kind of a case studies about basically Iberian coast. The coastal region actually somewhere in the Europe actually where basically is nowadays conquered by Spain and Portugal, if I'm right. And through the studying of basically that the Iberian context actually and the study of geography, she's going to show us the framework basically how it is differ between the post-colonialism with basically decoloniality and the southern epistemology. So I wouldn't take longer than that. I'll request basically Joanna to start her lecture. And after the lecture, we'll have a basically question answering session. So Joanna, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. Yes, I wanted to underline, first of all, that I'm very grateful and honored for this invitation. Thank you very much, Professor Nizar. I'm also a bit nervous. I'm a PhD researcher, so I'm not a full professor or a senior researcher. So I will do my best to present, let's say, a mapping of anti-colonial thoughts within the situation and the territory of the Iberian Peninsula and its history of colonialism. And also, as Professor Nizar has underlined, I am an art historian. So I like to look at historical phenomenon also through art history and artistic practices. So you will see throughout the presentation that I have selected artworks, some of which I will comment about and some of which less. But if you would like, we can discuss them in further detail if you have questions at the end of the session. And I'm very much open to criticism and discussion, and I'm looking forward to the discussion at the end of this presentation, which I hope will open up for broader conversations on these topics, and I hope you will find it relevant for the context of Bangladesh as well. So thank you very much for this invitation, and I will dive into the presentation now. So this presentation will critically examine post-colonial, decolonial thoughts and what is called the epistemologies of the South, focusing on the Iberian Peninsulas and its semi-peripheral position within European imperialism. And so I will look at Spain and Portugal's fraught colonial legacies, exemplified by both countries' dual roles as pioneers of colonial capitalism, but also later as failed hegemons. And so I will expose also internal hierarchies within Europe, which are complicating narratives of coloniality. And I will look a little bit at the marginalization within the European Union of Portugal and Spain, which also underscores how imperial difference persists epistemically, and also economically. So can you show the next slide, please? Thank you. And so I'm just starting with a contextualization to situate a little bit the history that we are talking about. And so if we look at early imperialism, we can see that Portugal was a pioneer and the first European power to industrialize racial slavery, transporting in total 5.8 million Africans between 1444, when the first enslaved Africans were taken from the west coast of Africa to the beach of Lagos in the south of Portugal, and the 19th century. And so Lisbon's, but we can see also Sevilla, Cadiz and Lagos were ports that were hub when enslaved people were re-exported to Latin America, which embedded racial capitalism into Europe's economy. And it's important to note that Spain and Portugal dominated early slave trade until 1640. They were responsible for 97% of the transportation of enslaved African to Latin America, or what became Latin America. You can show the next slide, please. Yes, it's very important also to say that in the metropolitan territories, not only the crown, but also the nobility and the clergy of the Catholic Church were involved into slavery. And here it's a quite famous painting by an anonymous painter that is kept in a museum in Lisbon that shows a neighborhood of Lisbon where you see a scene of daily life with an astonishing concentration of African people with different social and economic status, which demonstrates after research that 10% of the city's population was of African descent. And so when we today in Europe hear discourses about migration being a recent phenomenon, you can actually understand that at least within the history of European imperialism and, for instance, the transatlantic slave trade, this is a history that has actually 500 years. And this is very much also something that you can see in the material heritage around us, in the architecture, in sculptures. And there's a lot of researchers that are looking at this material heritage here in the Iberian Peninsula today. Can you show the next slide, please? And so 1492 is a very crucial moment in which two things are actually, two events, historical events are occurring at the same time. On the one hand, there is what has been called as the Reconquest, the Reconquista. And on the other hand, the so-called discoveries of Americas and the Caribbeans by Columbus voyages. And so on the one hand, you have the expulsion of Jews and Muslims that happened at the moment of the final reconquest of the Islamic world that was actually part of the Iberian Peninsula for over 500 years. And 1492 is the moment in which the Christian Crusaders won the last battle against the region of Granada. And at the same time, Columbus, as we say, opened the Southern America, even though it's open only for Europeans, right? And so it's actually encompassed what is called the colonial difference. So as the same year the Catholic monarchs expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain, Columbus reached the Americas. And so there is a twin violence here, an internal in which the Jews and the Muslims that were on the Iberian territories were expelled. And so Walter Mignolo is calling this an imperial difference, which is a religious difference between the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims. And on the other hand, an external colonial difference, which is a racial hierarchy created from, on the one hand, the Europeans and the others, who are the indigenous people of Southern America. And so the struggle of Christian Spain and Portugal against Islam formed part of a long imperial struggle in the Mediterranean Sea that goes back to the Crusades. But so this question of the Christian versus the Islamic struggle articulated what Walter Mignolo, as I said, characterizes as the imperial differences. And this imperial difference resonates with the colonial difference, with the post-1492 Spanish genocide of the indigenous people of Central and Southern America. What is also important to say is that in 1500, a Portuguese named Pedro Cabral, who was sailing to India, was blown out into the Atlantic and landed on the coast of Brazil, giving Portugal its first foothold in what was to become Brazil. And so Spanish and Portuguese rivalry was a long-term process, which was finally settled by the Treaty of the Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the so-called unknown world between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and which actually frame most of what we know as Brazil on the one hand and Spanish-speaking Latin American countries. And as Stuart Hall reminds us, the misnamed West Indies are a permanent reminder that the old world actually discovered the new by accident. And what is also important is that there were, in Latin America, there were functioning societies, very complex societies, organized societies that were nothing but European. And so what disturbed European expectation, what had to be negotiated and explained was their difference. And so as the centuries passed, Europeans came to know more about the specific characteristics of the different Native American people. Yet in everyday terms, they persisted in describing them all as Indians. And so it shows that distinctions together and suppress difference in one, creating inaccurate stereotypes. I think also one thing that is important to underline here is within Immanuel Wallerstein's world system theory, in which he analyzes what he names historical capitalism. And he looks at three moments in the development of Western imperialism. And for instance, the first moment that was characterized by Spain, then the second one by the Netherlands, and the third one by England. And he shows us three of them played a crucial but distinct roles in the development and evolution of the capitalist world economy. And so each represented different phases of hegemonic transition. And so Spain in the 16th century is what he names a failed hegemon, in the sense that it accumulated wealth, but without capitalist transformation. And so it was the first major European power to extract vast wealth, for instance, gold, silver, from its colonies, especially in the Americas. But also it became semi-peripheral because it helped fuel the rise of other imperialism, such as the Dutch one, and then the English one, that to establish a sort of sustainable, if we can call it like that, a capitalist system. And so I think here the notion of Walter Mignolo, when he calls something an internal imperial difference, is very important, because you can see throughout the process of the colonization of the Americas that and the implementation of historical capitalism, that Southern Europe has experience with Spain and Portugal, and the Western post-Enlightenment empires, such as France, England, and the Netherlands, were on a different hierarchical situation, in the sense that the intellectuals of the post-Enlightenment empires were responsible for making the European Catholic South, such as the Iberian Peninsula, an inferior sector of Europe. So there's already a differentiation throughout the history of imperialism in Europe, and the creation of a form of peripherality of the Iberian Peninsula within the development of Western imperialism. Can you show the next slide, please? So I'm doing here a leap, a very fast forward leap to the 20th century, by just saying that obviously throughout the 19th century, Portugal and Spain, as much of the Western European countries, developed the process of the nation states, the construction of the nation states, with liberal revolutions, but also different type of monarchic, conservative processes and battles between the two. And within them, obviously, colonialism was very important. The colonialism process, the colonial process over Africa and Asia within the 19th century is a moment extremely important in the construction of the nation states of Europe, and which leads us already to the 20th century and the construction of the dictatorships, because both countries in the Iberian Peninsula have been very long-term dictatorships within the 20th century, which relied very much on colonial nostalgia and on these two myths that I talked about at the beginning. The first one is the reconquista, the reconquest. So basically the conquest of the territories that were Muslim in Andalusia and in Portugal, in the central and southern part of Portugal. And the other myth is discoveries, the great discoveries. And so Franco, who was the dictator in Spain, but also Salazar, who was the dictator in Portugal, built very much a narrative that was centered on these two pillars. And here you have a photography by Alfredo Cunha, which is a photography of what in Portugal is named Padrão dos Descobrimentos, which is basically a monument to the great discoveries that was constructed, that was built during Salazarism, during the dictatorship in Portugal in the 40s, and then it was rebuilt in the 60s. And here this picture is a bit of already a critical look at this history, because you can see a picture in 1975, so after the revolution, after the dictatorship ended, in which you can see the port occupied by wooden boxes that show the arrival of 6,000 people from the Portuguese ex-colonies of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, and Cape Verde. And so you can see here the regime monument to the discoveries, contrasted with these wooden boxes that actually demonstrates the end of the Portuguese Empire, and also the victory of the liberation struggles that accelerated the Carnation Revolution in Portugal and put an end to the fascist dictatorship of Salazar. On the other hand, Spain negotiated its transition in another way after the death of Franco, with a process that was a bit different, as it kept the monarchy and organized a transition in which some of Francoist elites and institutions remained in place, not touching upon the history of fascist repression within the country, and for instance, the history of the Civil War. So you have different transitions or so, but both countries entered the European Union in 1986. And what is interesting is that the colonial history and the two pillars of the Reconquista and the discoveries became also, or were let's say, repackaged as cosmopolitanism, but very important elements in the narrative of Portugal and Spain as their identity within the European Union. So even though they were fascist myths, or nationalist and then fascist myths, they were reconstructed as also elements that were kept in liberal democracies after the democratic transitions. Can you show the next slide, please? And so it's true that in Spain, for instance, the celebration around Columbus and with a lot of monuments and sculpture already started in the late 19th century, as identified by a lot of artists who are working on this question. Here I have a quote by Francisco Godoy Vega, who's looking at the very presence of these sculptures until today and the fact that they remain, but some of them are also built and inaugurated in the 21st century. And it's interesting how the Spanish and Portuguese states fraught reckoning with their colonial history, particularly visible during the 1992 500 celebration of the conquest of the Americas, as they name it, and the 1998 Lisbon World Exhibition in Lisbon that was known as Expo 98. They produced spectacular apparatus of events that stage a kind of relaunch of Spain and Portugal's central role in the construction of the so-called modern world, which framed discoveries and its main contribution to European power. And so the two countries have been reusing or repackaging the narratives present on the fascism in the process of their democratic transition. And so they separated, in a way, the metropolitan fascism from the history of transatlantic slavery and colonial violence, and as if they were not two sides of the same coin. And so they missed the opportunity to produce an analysis of the fact that fascism and colonialism are co-constitutive. And here I chose an image of an artistic intervention in 2007 by an Angolan artist, Kilwanji Kia Henda, who subverted this monument to the discoveries, which is still a staple in tourism. If you're going to Lisbon, most of the guides will tell you to go there and take pictures. So it's completely normalizing actually this fascistic heritage and this celebration of colonial past. And so the artist, he actually invited young Black men from the Lisbon outskirts to the monument to actually place them as bringing them into presence and show the very effects of the so-called discoveries and colonialism, and compelling people to address them rather than commemorating and naturalizing violent colonial pasts. And so what is interesting also is that these events promoted sanitized form of sanitized narratives of discovery and progress, but there were also counter movements by Latin American, but also people of African and Asian descent in the countries in the Iberian Peninsula to protest against this type of repackaging, and for instance proposing alternative and oppositional narratives. And already in the late 80s, some cultural agents started to suffer and to reverse the pain of this long Columbus hangover. We can call it like that. And if you can show the next slide, there is an example of this type of resistance. Here, it's a collective that was against the exhibition in Seville that was repackaging actually the Great Discovery as an intercultural exchange, which is a beautiful euphemism. And so this collective was called Desenmascaremos el 92, Let's Unmask 92. And so it was a collective endeavor that was calling for boycotts, but also intervening in the public space and criticizing very much not only, as I said, the neutralization of the colonial past, but also the way the European integration process created a form of peripheralization of the Iberian Peninsula and turned it into a tourist periphery for European well-off travelers. And what is interesting is that these big events, like the Universal Exhibition in Sevilla and then the one in International Exhibition in Lisbon, became sites for what David Harvey has called an accumulation by dispossession, where rent and industrial development, replaced industrial development. And so these events were tied to gentrification in the form of rent, and so were a phenomenon of gentrification, but also internal subalternization, transforming Portugal and Spain into tourist destination for people from Northern and Central Europe. And so here you can see that there is also within the very European project forms of spatial division of labor, but also center-periphery dynamics that somehow resonates with the fact that Spain and Portugal were failed hegemon in the imperial endeavor of different European nations and empires. So can you show the next slide, please? Thank you. So here I would like to transition. So this was just to ground a little bit my presentation in the context of the Iberian Peninsula. And now we will look a little bit more about this anti-colonial constellation of different school of thoughts. And for instance, look precisely at postcolonialism, decoloniality, and epistemologies of the South, which are three main ways of critically approaching the consequences of European colonialism in contemporary social, political, but also cultural ways of thinking and acting. And they converge in highlighting the unmeasurable sacrifice of human life, the expropriation of cultural and natural wealth, and the destruction by suppressing, silencing, prescribing, and subjugating non-European cultures and ways of knowing. But there are also differences among them that stem in part from the temporal, but also geographical context in which they emerged. And so the scholarly work on postcolonialism and decoloniality focuses more on the consequences or repercussions of European colonialism in contemporary social, political, and cultural ways. But consequences and repercussions are, however, formulated differently, as you will see. And here I also chose an artwork by Moses Martz, who is an interesting graphic artist who is working on mapping different relational processes, for instance, in the birth of anti-colonial thinking, and showing the complex, actually, relationality between the different schools, but also between different geographies and different geographical environments, to show a little bit the complexity also of this mapping, and the fact that despite me trying to organize it in a, let's say, a more structured way, obviously, everything is more complex than that. Can you show the next slide, please? Thank you. So if we start with the post-colonial studies, if we speak from a sociology of knowledge perspective, we can see that the difference between post-colonial and decolonial studies bear at least some relationship with the different types of modern colonialism I was talking about. And for instance, post-colonial studies developed in the aftermath of the independences in the 1960s, which have been mainly concerned with colonialism in Africa and Asia. And so they focused mainly on the last hegemon, if we speak in Immanuel Wallerstein's language, of European capitalism. And so it looks also at its political and cultural consequences, for instance, the consequences of decolonization, but highlighting the post-independence forms of economic dependence, political subordination, and also, very important, the cultural subalternization. And so they argue that while historical colonialism has ended, colonialism continued under different guises, and for instance, under a more cultural one and under a more economic one. And for instance, from another perspective, post-colonial studies are considered to be mainly concerned with the political economy of the post-independence relations between the colonizers and the colonized. For instance, through questions such as the dependent development, but also unequal trade, control over natural resources, military tutelage, international alignments, imperialism, and so notions of neocolonialism, as it has been coined by Kwame Nkrumah, are very important. to look at the impact of the economic infrastructure of the West through the IFM and the World Bank, for example, but also to look more critically at a return to the sources, so look at the knowledge and the epistemologies that were produced by these countries before colonization and through struggle, such as the fundamental political processes in the world of Amílcar Cabral, who, for example, who was a very important figure in the liberation struggles of the former Portuguese colonies, and mainly Angola and also Guinea-Bissau. And one last thing that can be said about postcolonial studies here, one last thing, I mean, I'm really summing up everything, and I'm sure that you're more knowledgeable than me about a lot of its aspects, so we can discuss it later. But it may be argued that postcolonial scholarship produced in the global north relied more on Eurocentric intellectual traditions. For instance, with Edward Said or Gayatri Spivak or Homi Bhabha, you can find post-structuralism, deconstruction, psychoanalysis in their approach of postcolonialism. But you can also see that different anti-colonial traditions, such as the ones of Kwame Nkrumah or Amílcar Cabral, were much more influenced by Marxism and an analysis of more sovereign approaches of local economies after independence, for example. Can you show the next slide, please? So now if we move to decoloniality, yes, it's a very funny, it's a film still that I just selected. It's a bit of it's a pun as well, a humoristic approach, let's say, of very important questions by a collective of Latin American migrants living in Spain that is called AILU. And for instance, they imagine that they have superpower and they can destroy the sculptures of Christopher Columbus that you can find everywhere in the public space in Spain through what they call anti-colonial Avengers. So it's just, you can check their film. It's a very interesting approach as well. And so if we think about decoloniality, this is another school of thought that emerged in the 1990s, here mainly in Latin America. And so their scholarship revealed how 1492 marked not merely the beginning of Spanish colonialism, but the violent inauguration of a world system predicated on multiple intersecting forms of domination. And for instance, one of the most important maybe conclusion that can be taken out of the decolonial school is that modernity and coloniality are co-constitutive, as the group Modernity Coloniality that was founded in 1993 also is stating. And so according to these authors, such as Aníbal Quijano or Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, and then Enrique Dussel, Walter Mignolo, and many, many others, colonialism is the underlying logic of the foundation and unfolding of Western civilization from the Renaissance to today. And so the decolonial approach exposes the racial, political, and social hierarchical orders imposed by modern European colonialism in Latin America and analyzes the living legacy of colonialism, an articulation of racial and gender power, and knowledge structures that outlived historical colonialism, and what they call coloniality, or the coloniality of power, which is something that goes beyond mere colonialism and that continues to exist even after liberation or independence. Can you show the next slide, please? And this leads us to the epistemologies of the South, which is a framework that have been mainly developed by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, if I'm trying to pronounce it in an understandable way. He's a Portuguese sociologist, and he calls, drawing obviously upon post-colonial, decolonial, and different type of anti-colonial framework, he calls for valuing knowledges that are, quote, born in struggle, so from peasant agroecology to indigenous cosmologies. And so the epistemologies of the South are inspired by the immense diversity of radical social struggle throughout the 20th century against the structural injustices caused by modern domination and the multiple oppressions it generates, as well as the plurality of collectives in struggle that did not fit Marx's historical subject, because famously, right, Marx was mainly focusing on the white working class, even though his Eurocentric approach was very much changed throughout his own trajectory. And at the end of his life, we can read, for example, the work of Kevin B. Anderson, who's looking at Marx questioning actually his own Eurocentrism and the subject of history of his own analysis. And so one of the quotes of the epistemologies of the South would be, there is no global justice without global cognitive justice. And so it looks not only at forms of genocide and of killing of people who are considered outside or others of Western modernity or Eurocentric modernity, but also at what is named epistemicide. So basically the erasure of forms of knowledge and forms of understanding and relations to the world that doesn't fit the Eurocentric approach. And so to give an example of types of struggle that are considered important in the epistemologies of the South, for example, there is the Via Campesina, which combined peasant knowledge with agronomic, biochemical, health, and social knowledge, and in many cases, a Marxist analysis of the land question, particularly land rent. And so these articulations and combinations form what Boaventura de Sousa Santos names ecologies of knowledges that mutually transform different ways of knowing as they engage in dialogues geared to strengthen social struggle against domination. And one important maybe contribution also to this approach of the epistemologies of the South has been, maybe you heard of it throughout the 2000s, the social forum that was organized, so the International or World Social Forum, that was events that were organized within the 2000s, mainly in Porto Alegre in Brazil, but then also around the world. And that have been a continued spaces for the assertion of an alter globalist vision of development, but also of fraternity between peoples and nations, that under, let's say, the slogan of another world is possible. And so it was a way to counter globalization through a perspective of the South and alter globalization. And obviously there is a big critique here of academic cooptation and the question of grassroots practices. So yeah, you can go to the next slide, please. So now that I've done this mapping, which is a very rough mapping, I understand, and then we maybe can go into detail and look at some of it with more being more precise. I have to address critiques that have been formulated, for instance, in direction of the epistemologies of the South and Boaventura de Sousa Santos' very present figure within this framework. And for instance, the sociologist Nirman Puvar, she has published an article in 2020 in which she was looking at what she names the center staging problem. And not only the question of center staging the South, and so looking at knowledges of the South to rethink Eurocentrism and the history of Eurocentric modernity and coloniality, but also the question of center staging personalities within Northern academia. And for instance, Puvar, she warns that scholars like Boaventura de Sousa Santos can become gatekeepers of Southern theory in the Northern academia, and so leapfrogging other types of anti-colonial traditions. And so she looks at the way, obviously, neoliberal academia is organized around charismatic figures who can package dissent into, let's say, academic brands. And so she looks at the way the act of decentering established Euro-North American sites and flows of knowledge as long-standing geopolitical anchors of epistemological authority present scenarios that she names déjà vu, in the sense that she already saw it, and that are things that are repeated throughout the history of knowledge production. And she names it also involved in center staging processes. And so she says that the very position of being a messenger from the north of knowledge and theory from the south has a risk to reproduce the same patterns that undertaking seeks to unsettle. Next to that, I obviously have to mention a book chapter that has been published in 2023 by 3 former researchers at the Center of Social Studies that have been looking or critically unpacking the way the production of knowledge in what they name avant-garde academia, so critical academia, is also very much embedded in forms of power relations, but also forms of violence and, for instance, sexual power gatekeeping. And they've been accusing Boaventura de Sousa Santos of sexual harassment and also a form of intellectual extractivism. And so here I think that what is interesting, less than focusing on one person and individualize the question, was that it actually stemmed a big discussion within Portuguese academia for instance, thinking about academia as a workplace in which there are processes and dynamics that are embedded in neoliberal capitalism that create competition, but also relations of power that are often very much non-acknowledged within academia itself. And for instance, this was the case in the Center of Social Studies, which was the center that Boaventura de Sousa Santos contributed to create in the late 1970s after the fall of the Portuguese dictatorship. And that still exists and persists as a very important place for critical knowledge production in Portugal, but in Europe as well. And so that even when it's progressive, radical places for knowledge production, they are not devoid of these type of power relations and power dynamics that can create patterns for abuse. And so, for instance, it had stemmed, as I said, a very important discussion within Portuguese academia, but also inside the Center of Social Studies, which led actually Boaventura de Sousa Santos to step down of his position of honorary professor last year, I think. And since then, also a lot of reshaping of the internal organization of the Center of Social Studies. Next slide, please. And so I think here I'm more opening questions than giving direct answers, but it really asks questions about the position of Western academia, at least, and the way it is structured, and the way it creates forms of knowledge production markets in which sometimes even radical knowledge, such as anti-colonial, as we have seen, postcolonial, decolonial, and epistemologies of the South, can become what Dylan Rodriguez has named counterinsurgency, serving counterinsurgency. And so saying that Western academia is also embedded as an institution within modern Eurocentric domination, but also within forms of still now persisting imperialism. And so it reminds us that social and cultural institutions often aim at neutralizing radical movements. And for instance, as he says, if considered historically, we know that since 1492 and the so-called discovery of Southern America and the Caribbeans, colonial powers have been mastering counterinsurgency in order to maintain the violent racial colonial capitalist order intact. And I can just give the example of the current situation with the genocide ongoing in Gaza, and the fact that even within progressive academia, for instance, here in Portugal, there have been massive pressure before the Center of Social Studies took position and gave a public statement condemning Israel colonial policies today in Gaza, but also taking sanction at collaboration with Israeli universities today. And so we see that even within progressive institutions, it's not even always easy to articulate a theoretical critique with a practical engagement. And obviously to say that nobody's free until Palestine is free. And so this is something that is very much today at the core of a lot of these debates within Western academia, with some forms of repression more or less strong, as you can see in the campuses in the United States, but also in Germany, in France. In Portugal, it's very much difficult to have this discussion as well, even though the repression is not that strong. And the next slide, please. And I wanted to finish this conversation with an artwork that I really like, and also say that the epistemologies of the South framework, which is embedded in Northern academia, operates within structural constraints, as I said. And so even progressive Portuguese and Spanish institutions must navigate a national context where political elites and a significant part of civil society aspire to Northern cultural norms, often depoliticizing colonial reckoning. And so Boaventura de Sousa Santos and the Center of Social Studies Southern project, if we want to call it like that, exists in tension with its origins as part of both countries' post-dictatorial democratic academic infrastructure and European integration, which operates within an educational policy framework that privileges Eurocentric norms. And this exemplifies the contradictions of aspiring epistemologies of the South located in nation states that are part of the European Union, a project that perpetuates today imperial domination and colonial hierarchies through economic policies and cultural racism, all while obscuring its imperial foundations through narratives of post-historical progress. And so here, Daniela Ortiz is an artist who made this let's say also a commentary, an artistic commentary on another progressive institution, which is the National Museum of Contemporary Art, Reina Sofia, which is in Madrid, in Spain, where you can find the painting, a famous painting by Pablo Picasso, dedicated to Guernica. Guernica was a city that was bombed by a coalition of fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, together with Franco during the Spanish Civil War in the Basque Country. And so while the painting became a symbol of anti-fascist resistance, the museum in 2022 invited the spouses of NATO members to use it as a background for an official picture. And so the artist is very much criticizing also the instrumentalization of a museum that is considered also very much radical, and that is trying to also develop a strategy that we could call a museum of the South, as much as the Center of Social Studies at the University of Coimbra is trying to develop a form of University of the South within the European Union. But you have moments in which the very fact that we still are in an imperialist continent is very much reminded, such as this moment with the NATO members in front of the picture. And so she imagine a revenge from the anti-colonial history and anti-fascist history, with the pictures falling on these representatives, hence demonstrating that anti-colonial resistance is still very much alive and won't accept that kind of, let's say, weaponizing of their own history. So I will leave it like that, I think, and we can discuss and open the discussion. And I hope that was useful for you and interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. That was really great, actually. It kind of help us to understand the difference between that global South and decoloniality, along with the basically post-colonialism. But I think some of us probably got questions, actually. So while we are discussing about basically and during the question and answer time, things might be much more clearer, actually. But thanks once again, actually. It was really nice talk. So the floor is open now, and anybody can go ahead. And yeah, please go.
Is there
Can
anybody,
I?
or I can pose a question?
Oh,
Right.
yeah. Tassin, go ahead.
Yeah, it was really an interesting lecture, specifically your discussion on coloniality. But my question is basically about the coloniality of the concepts, specifically in context of Bangladesh, because I don't know if you know about that on the 5th of August, on the last year, Bangladesh had an uprising that is called July Uprising. So after the uprising, there was a committee that was formed for some of the constitutional changes that will make. So regarding that constitutional changes, one of the policies or one of the proposal they have proposed is that using the word pluralism rather than using the word secularism. So my question is basically the coloniality of the concept of secularism, that how far we can actually criticize the coloniality of these concepts. Because as you know that already in Spain is constitutionally not a secular country, but on the other hand, Portugal is a secular country, as you already know. But in the countries like Bangladesh and India, we have the word secularism that has a colonial undertones. And not to mention, the word secularism also has a French connotation, as you know. But at the same time, the word colonialism or the concept of secularism, it has a colonial legacy, as you can guess. So as they are now proposing the word pluralism rather than secularism, how far you think we should criticize the coloniality of the concept secularism in the situations or in the context of Bangladesh? Or do you think that using the word pluralism is kind of trying to softening up the principles of religious tolerance?
Thank you. Should I answer straight away?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. First, I would say that I will absolutely not give any advice of what Bangladesh people should do. It's really not my position. But about secularism, I think there's an amazing book by a researcher of Algerian descent, but I think he's French, Mohamed Ahmed Amer Meziane. I can send you afterwards the reference, who is looking very much at the coloniality of secularism and the way secularism is very much linked to colonial processes, but also to, which is interesting, fossil capitalism. So he's looking at the way the moment the construction of nation states, post-enlightenment social states, post-enlightenment nation states, is linked to the criticism of the sky. So basically there's secularity and the moment in which the criticism of God and then the birth of modern sciences is linked to the moment in which people were these specific nation states, and for instance Britain but also France, were starting to dig and starting basically what is named now fossil colonialism, so fossil capitalism, so using coal and then different type of fuel combustion that inaugurated our new form of capitalism. And I think here his critique of secularism is might be interesting for you, because he's very much looking at the coloniality of the concept and the fact that it comes together with imperial expansion and the expansion through fossil capitalism. And so it's very much, for instance, if you look at the wars that have started in the 19th century and that are ongoing today in the Middle East, that are all centered around resources, and for instance, resources that you have to extract from the earth, is very much linked to secularism, but also to the creation of Islam as the great other of Western modernity, which is something that we can see in all the Islamophobia that is developed throughout Europe, from Portugal to, I don't know, Finland and Estonia, right? So I think maybe I didn't sum it up in a clear way, but this book, which in French is Des Empires sous la Terre, I have to check I know it has been translated and published in Adverso, but I will send the reference, and I think that can be a very interesting one to look at the criticism of secularism from an anti-colonial perspective, and that might be an interesting how do you say, like a thread to explore for the question of what type of term to use in Bangladesh specifically.
Well,
Thank you
I think
for the
I just like to yeah, I just like to add something actually to this discussion actually. So there isn't a significant number of criticism about the secularism actually from a post-colonial perspective, along with the decoloniality too. But there is another aspect that definitely the secularism is a byproduct of basically Western Enlightenment. The human centrism and new humanism is at very center of the whole idea. But there's another interesting aspect to it actually, that usually when we kind of try to locate secularism, we always locate secularism within the Eurocentric understanding and European his experience of it. On the other hand, like the word we use actually in Bengali actually is called dharma nirapekkota, which slightly have a different connotation in here actually. So broadly, there isn't two approach in secularism, as we have seen actually in like Europe. Legally, it could be a separationist approach, which is usually known as basically that American separationist approach, actually constitutional separatism. On the other hand, we got basically laicite. So laicite and separatism is slightly different. Actually, the laicite is more often basically
Yeah.
because they have been basically highly influenced by the Catholic Church. So wherever there is a Catholic Church, huge number of influence of the religion. So like dismantling that actually becoming very important. Whereas basically American form actually, which is coming up and from a Protestant background, no church was strong enough. So in that case, actually, what had happened that like there is an more often like basically distancing the state from the religion rather than suppressing it actually or dismantling it. So there's slightly two different approach. But on the other hand, actually, if we look at the Bangladeshi one, it has some form of organic tune. So what happened in Bangladesh actually, even before independence, which was in 1971, and after the post-independence, the Bengali intellectual, when they usually talk about secularism, they usually discuss both sides were criticizing it and in favor of it. They're both coming from and basically that yeah, they're addressing basically European concept of secularism. Whereas we got a constitution which was basically proposed and adopted actually in 1972, which kind of a see like slightly different way than the probably laicite or secularism in American context. They kind of see it actually basically not as in basically dismantling religion, rather than they see through basically through their organic experience what had happened during the late period of Pakistan era actually that and especially in the during the liberation war that like there's an by using the religion actually there is an like some form of violence and dehumanization of particular group of people and some form of basically mass number of killing of basically intellectual and other people along with basically they connect with basically that like in the context of us actually from the post 35 actually that communal is a very important aspect actually like the different religion has a different community and which was part and parcel of basically British administrative policy that to segregate the different the community which is very common everywhere actually wherever the colony went down there they always segregated people in the different name. So the in a way, the way Bangladesh defines secularism, I know it's a misleading word in many ways because they even used in English translation the secularism, whereas in Bengali they use a different word. There's a decommunalization. So their understanding of it is very different from the basically the traditional understanding of basically European, which is coming from the European experience. And so that's one of the aspect actually that what we have realized over the like last few decades that some of the criticism actually, which is whether it is done by the post-colonialist or basically decolonialist, they kind of the discussion is centered around basically European experience, which is kind of like an echo or mirror image of basically we can say like what you have mentioned it that post-structural inspired by the post-structuralism or post-modernity. That's one of the problems. That's why like some of that scholarship doesn't really help basically this sort of like countries actually where different sort of context and circumstance, but it's kind of an ongoing discussion going on. I think Tasmin want to add up something, isn't it? Please go ahead.
Another thing that I really wanted to add here is the redefining the concept of public space, because at some extent, secularism means that the um, mis- secularism basically comes from not using religious things in the public spaces, but the concept of public space itself has a cultural dimension in every places, specifically in the global south and even in the global north, because what is public space for Bangladesh is not same as the definition of public space in US, right? So in terms of like redefining the word secularism or reconceptualizing it, I think we need to, or one should also refer or consider the concept of public space too.
That's very legitimate. Yeah. Uh, someone else like to go ahead? Any question? Any other questions?
Sir, I am going to ask question to Joanna. Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Yeah.
So, Jonah, thank you very much for your thoughtful presentation. So, I am going to ask you for my further clarification that you know that the articulation of colonial metrics of power or coloniality, or to some extent we said coloniality of power, this is very related with the conquest of America. But we know that I think adoption of capitalism and also racial division of labor or something like that, this kind of things. So when you were questioning that there is also some, I think, territories from that metropolitan powers that were semi-peripheral or something like that. So are you trying to, I think, question the uh, consolidation of that matrix of you are trying to making, I think, present some fluidity inside from within the colonial matrix of power or something like that. But again, I will ask, so is it your attempt that you are trying to problematize the presentation of Mignolo and their schools that colonial matrix of power is not so consolidated as Nelson Maldonado Torres, I think, defined it as the so it is something like that we are breathing in coloniality or something. So the first question is, are you trying to problematizing this idea that this colonial matrix of power is very fragile from within? Second one, it is, I think it sounds funny, that's are you trying to, I think, escape from that colonial matrix of power? Or I am going to ask another very focused question to you that what was the contribution of this Iberian Peninsula to articulate this colonial matrix of power? Maybe these three questions are very related. uh, am I clear to you?
Yes, thank you very much. I think definitely I didn't express it in a clear way. When you say about the flexibility, let's say, or the fluidity within the matrix, the colonial matrix of power, it's not really about fluidity. But I think, for instance, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, some of his writings are explicitly speaking about Portugal as a form of colony, for instance, of Britain, within the 18th and mainly 19th century expansion, industrial expansion of Britain. And I think I have a background in Russian studies, so here I'm comparing things that are maybe not very comparable. But Russia, the Russian Federation after the fall of the USSR and the violent, let's say, integration within global capitalism, and has also spoken of a form of colonialism. And I think we have to problematize that, because using the word colonialism in these circumstances, I'm not saying that they are not violence. And as we said, as I tried to present, there are processes of peripheralization. So within Europe, there are also inequalities and center periphery dynamics, but they are not colonialism. And we cannot speak about colonialism. And I think that speaking about colonialism for me is rather problematic. So I would say that, yes, I would like to problematize it, but in this sense, that otherwise it relativizes a history of violence and also the history of the construction of racial capitalism and white supremacy, in which all of these countries are embedded, as much Russia as Portugal, as Britain. Then we can discuss, obviously, the nuances, the different historical periods, but all of them are part of it and contribute to its continuation. Whereas when we speak about colonialism, we speak about the global south and its history of actual, genocide, exploitative, and also extractivism, and the continuation of coloniality within these places, but also imperial or neocolonial economic policies. So you're right that I think we have to problematize the use of the term colonial, but without forgetting the complexities internal to the European Union, which I'm interested in because I'm from the Portuguese territory, and so I'm directly concerned with it. And we can see that there are center periphery dynamics that also create relations and, for instance, a division of labor that can be compared, but not completely, to some north-south dynamic. So what I'm saying is that, for instance, the central bank and the economic policies that are developed and that are embedded in the Lisbon Treaty that was signed in 2005 create rent economies and peripheralization within Europe that we could learn, basically, Portugal and Spain could learn from processes of resistance that already exist and existed for a long time in the global south. That's what I'm saying. And then your other question was, yes, the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, the only thing that the Iberian Peninsula, first of all, it's at the origin, as I tried to demonstrate, of the transatlantic slavery, for instance, and Portuguese were the first ones to explore the western coast of Africa and create the plantation system in the island of São Tomé and Príncipe, which then was generalized by the Spanish and then expanded through the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire. But also, I think that maybe a perspective that is interesting, and it's thanks to the people who have resisted and created these epistemologies, comes from the now, today, Lusophone and Spanish-speaking world. Whereas if you look at Northern academia, you mainly have a focus on postcolonial or sometimes also French-speaking anti-colonial theory, which is very important, for instance, emanating from the Caribbeans, such as Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, etc. So what I'm saying is that it doesn't add anything in the sense that this is embedded in a history that was inaugurated by the colonial policies of the Iberian monarchies. But on the other hand, if we now look at, let's say, the Anglophone hegemony in Western academia, the knowledge that is produced from Latin America, but also from the Portuguese-speaking and Spanish-speaking African countries. Let's not forget that Guinea Equatorial was a Spanish colony, and also from some Asian countries, brings something that sometimes is a little bit left under the carpet by, let's say, mainstream post-colonial or decolonial approaches within Anglophone academia. I don't know if I answered your question.
Okay, thank you so much. I get your position.
I have a little question to ask. Just it's kind of first of all, thank you, Joanna. It's a wonderful experience. My question is simple, and I just want to know your opinion. Actually, I mean, to what extent the concept of epistemology of the South can survive institutional cooperation within Northern academia? But I mean, is reform from within possible, or does it require building or completely an alternative structure?
Yes, yeah, that's a bit the question that I was also asking in the presentation. It looks a little bit like it's embedded in contradictions, right? I mean, we all live in a capitalist society in which we all are confronted with its contradictions. But the criticism that have been addressed to the epistemologies of the South, which are very centered around one figure, very charismatic figure, that created a sort of a brand as well, an academic brand within, let's say, the market of knowledge production within Northern academia. Very much, even though it has created processes such as I said, the World Social Forum, and places where different type of struggles and activism could encounter and create different type of what he call intercultural translation. Despite all that, we can see that it replicates also form of extractivism in which knowledges born from struggles of the South are in a way reframed within Northern academia and create different types of how do you say it, academic careers. And where the limitations really touches a dead end is when he was accused of violence and sexual harassment against not only researchers, but also different activists from the Global South. So I think here we see very much the limitation and the reproduction of a coloniality, of a colonial matrix of power within this very framework. I have to say that I was at the Center of Social Studies when all these discussions started to become public a few years ago. I think it was in 2023. And obviously it has very much troubled the whole organization of the Center of Social Studies with different positions among the researchers within the center and within academia. And I don't think I have an answer. Do you have an answer? What do you think?
It's a kind of, but to me, it's a kind of, deadlock situation. And I just couldn't figure it out any way to. It's a very, tricky situation. So that's why I actually asked you the. I think it's
Can
a
I
very
try
challenging
to?
situation.
Can actually, I have some idea about. I mean, the conception of museum, like the British Museum, how they collect artifacts from the different parts of the world. I think this kind of academy, I'm not sure whether it's kind of a museum sort of a thing. I mean, collecting ideas from global south and establishing, I mean, an institute inside of it. So, I mean, this was actually coming to my mind, but I have to connect some other, I mean, questions. You're talking about the global south and the center staging process. And I mean, there is a conception of when you're talking about madrasa education, you know about the madrasa education in here in, I mean, this part of the world, Islamic world, basically. So, uh, when you are talking about madrasa education, right now it's like um, kind of uh, a version between secular education and madrasa education that originated from the idea of religion. So this religious education system is basically it's kind of there is a contrast between the secular I mean education system and the religious education system. We know the history when Islam emerges as, I mean, I can call it like age of empire, when the empire flourishes around the world. This madrasa education actually provides a lot of, I mean, field for other kind of, I mean, there is astrology and there is mathematics and social science and all this sort of thing. But right now, it's only it's there is nothing left from that education system. Only some religious bigotry, maybe. I mean, some may oppose with my idea of madrasa education. But the thing is, this religious education system is dying. I mean, uh, maybe student is there is a lot of students still now, but it's dying from inside. And this secular education is, I mean, it's emerging all over the country. Sorry, all over the world actually, to some extent. So when we are talking about, I mean, you are talking about epistemic concept of this, I mean, global south thing. So when we are talking about this secular education versus this madrasa education that was originated from the, I mean, religious base. So I want to put one question actually in here. I mean, the thing is, do you think, I mean, liberating this kind of idea of madrasa education, will it help, like, for global South-centered education system? Now it's dying. I mean, is it possible to liberate itself from its own case and give it a new shape and propose it against the secular education? Is it possible actually? I mean, I'm sorry, and for that that part I talked about, I'm not sure about it, but I think it's kind of a collecting artifacts from all over the world and create a museum sort of thing. Do you think this idea is legit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the one to speak about. I think it always depends on the very history of a specific location, right? So if we look at territorialized history and the way maybe not only anti-colonial struggles but also pre-colonial existences, no, shaped the knowledge but also relation to the world within societies, we can find very, very interesting examples that can be reactivated in different way. And obviously, madrasa is something that is explored. I have colleagues from Morocco who are looking at reactivating this question of madrasa education in a different way and engaging in a different framework and understanding of what would be education in our society, if not taking a Eurocentric but also a secularized approach to it. I think that in the case of, if I'm speaking from Europe, but I imagine that in Bangladesh, I don't know how universities or education institutions are funded, But in Europe, obviously, they are also, if we look at the political economy of academia, we are embedded in the continuation of imperial policies and the fact that the accumulated wealth of Europe throughout its history of colonialism and the transatlantic slavery. I mean, most of the infrastructure that is built in Coimbra has been built thanks to the wealth accumulated because of transatlantic slavery, the subjugation of enslaved people, the plantation system, and then colonialism, plunder, and extractivism. So if we look at the political economy of it, you understand that there's something to be dismantled or abolished. So that's why there's a whole tendency, for instance, in critical race theory about abolition policies, to rethink institutions from scratch because their grounding is so embedded in the history of colonialism. But I guess that in the Islam world, madrasa education can be a very interesting grounding for rethinking the role of education. But again, it's difficult to speak about it. As I mentioned also at the beginning of my talk, I mean, most part of the Iberian Peninsula has been part of the Islamic world, from central to southern Portugal and also central to southern Spain was part of what was called Al-Andalus. And the Algarve in Portugal, which is the southern part, was part of Algarve Al-Andalus, so the western part of Al-Andalus, with some of the cities that were actually built from scratch in this period. So it also cancels the whole discourse about reconquista, the reconquest, that is still very much a staple in the national narrative in Portugal and very much linked to education. There are researchers at the Center of Social Studies that are looking at the way within the educational system, these type of nationalist narratives that are anchored in the question of the reconquest and the discoveries are still reproduced today in Portugal, for instance. And so if you look at the history of the Algarve, there were madrasas, there were places where actually we can think also of the coexistence of the different religious communities, the Muslims, but also the Jews and the Christians, and the fact that contemporary anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is also a European modern construction that came together with the Reconquista and the chasing away of the Jews and Muslims from the territories of the Iberian Peninsula, which basically was a continuation of the Crusades. So I think madrasa in these territories which have a direct connection with Islam is a very pertinent way to dig into and to think. But again, it depends on the history of the context. And if we look at Latin America, it probably has to be something else, right? Or Southeastern Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, for example.
Anyone else? I got a question. Oh, yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
I have a question from a different angle, actually. So it's about so when we talk about this globalization and everything and how the global economy is working, we cannot ignore just global capitalism and the neoliberal form of capitalism. So without encountering this question, it is difficult from the global south to develop something and creating the counter narrative. So the problem is, like, before we saw, like you talked about Nkrumah, and we also saw like import substitution industrialization in Latin America based on the dependency theory. We also saw like the concept of self-reliance from the global south, like India. Nehru tried about that. Nkrumah was a part of that. And we saw the global solidarity. They tried to restructure the global economy using the United Nations, but that didn't succeed. And also the ISI didn't succeed as well. So now the problem is that capitalism has changed itself since 1980s. It has turned into this neoliberal form, and which is more pervasive and using state as a tool to suppress people and to discipline people. So the question remains, like, how can we counter the narrative, Western narrative or the Eurocentric narrative or whatever it is, without altering this capitalist form of suppression and oppression, and without a like global without a unified force or unified system, it is difficult to counter capitalism. And we can't see that form of solidarity among the global south anymore. And there are resistances, definitely. Those are sporadic or like in different forms and different parts. But I mean, it's not only the question to you, but as well as other participants here, like how can we work on that? Because it is very important. I mean, criticizing or criticizing colonialism or capitalism is very easy compared to proposing something new. So I have been questioning, I've been raising this question to my professors as well, like to my friends as well, like what to do and how to do this. So, I mean, if you have any suggestions or like any discussion on that.
Yeah, I think it's key. I agree with you that while I was talking about the political economy in which academia is embedded, obviously now we are talking about neoliberal economy, but also I think we are in a moment of crisis of this neoliberal right with what now Trump and his approach of a very much more aggressive, but also what some people talk about techno-feudalism. So basically, we are moving from this neoliberalization of capitalist economy towards something else. We're in the process of this, and I mean, I'm as much as everyone else trying to analyze and understand what's going on. But I agree with you that without a critical analysis of political economy, I think we can't do anything. And I think that's one of the critique of some of what is called culturalist approaches that are mainly focusing on the symbolic, let's say, or from an idealist perspective. And I think it's still important to do this work. Obviously, I'm also working a lot with art and art practices, but within, for instance, the art sphere, but also with the debates that have happened at the Center of Social Studies, I think one thing that was key is to consider academia as a workplace and hence organize within this workplace and not only produce knowledge and participate in academic production and sometimes academic competition within neoliberalism, but also organize ourselves. So create, I mean, it's very old fashioned, but I mean, unions and thinking about ways of, combating in the workplace, socializing basically and collectivizing academia, which is not an easy thing to do. But I think at least when you have this type of approaches, you are more able to articulate at least this form, well, the structure and the infrastructure and the superstructure, to speak in Marxist terms. But then, would you say that, for instance, what's going on in Palestine, I don't know about Bangladesh, but is there a potential there for a new form of engagement from the global south and forms of solidarity across the global south of people trying to resist and seeing that this is the end of the international order based on international law and human rights? Do you think, is there a potential there? Because I'm thinking, is that reshaping somehow international and, for instance, global south solidarity in some way?
I mean, there is a possibility, but still we are very much, I can say, like disintegrated into different opinions, and there are
I don't
multiple
think
narratives here,
still,
to be honest.
there is no that kind of solidarity, that kind of solidarity. There might be some, and there might be some talk and all these things.
Yeah, I
Still there
agree.
is no solid structure.
Anyone else like to ask any questions or any comments? Well, I got a question for you, Joanna.
Yeah.
That's connected with somehow like it's just how like in the Mingolo and Quijano in some way influenced the Sosa, like how the decoloniality school of Latin America has influenced, or is there any influence at all actually on global Southern epistemology school?
Yeah, I think very much. I what I understand, I mean, I'm not a
And in
specialist.
which ways actually? Yeah, if you just explain that to us. Actually.
You mean the influence of the modernity coloniality school on the epistemologies of the South, correct?
Yes, decoloniality school from the in the Latin America actually, and how they have influence in some ways actually in the Southern epistemology school.
I mean, from what I know, I understand that Boaventura de Sousa Santos, he's himself a sociologist of knowledge, and he did his PhD thesis in the 70s in Brazil. So I think he encountered there.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And
I
so I
see,
think
but
there is this connection already in the, mainly Latin American knowledge production, even though we have to underline that there's a kind of a lack of dialogue between the Spanish-speaking countries and Brazil, which is the only Portuguese-speaking country, and which is an enormous country, right? There's 250 million people living there. I mean, I understand that in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, there are also many people, but for European standards, that's a lot of people in one country. And so I think there he got interested in this type of struggles and self-organization of groups in the military dictatorship under which was Brazil at the time. And from there, I understand that some dialogues were created with a school that is also called the Marxists of the South. So a lot of Marxists from Latin America who developed the dependence theory. So looking at the way an economic dependence was created between southern states and Western imperialism, for instance, mainly United States imperialism in South America. And so how it was reproduced through different type of accumulations. And from there, dialogues with the decolonial school. And so I think very much Aníbal Quijano, who's one of the forefather of this school of thoughts. But before him, you had also a Peruvian Marxist, Carlos Mariátegui, who's a very important thinker. And both of them have actually grounded or readapted Marxist reading, but through the realities of, through the Peruvian realities of indigenous peasants and indigenous economies. And I think that's also a very interesting approach to one of the problems of the Marxist schools I'm engaged with in Europe is that they are still today very much Eurocentric. And so to read these authors completely allows you to kind of see the flexibility of Marxism and the way it can be used as tools to understand other realities. And for instance, ground it then in theories that aim at liberation from the South. So I think these authors are very interesting. And Quijano obviously developed his very important framework of the coloniality of power, and also through the question of race, right? And the racialization of this coloniality and the racialization of the division of labor. And I think these were starting points, I mean, at least in the discussion that the Santos, when he started to develop his epistemologies of the South with the coloniality modernity school. And he very much from the beginning engaged with Enrique Dussel, philosophical approach and questioning of 1492 and the creation of this Eurocentric global order in which all continental philosophy is embedded, right? So I think this was a moment to question basically his own training as a Portuguese sociologist, and from there look also at the struggles developed from the South, and then very much being involved through the World Social Forum that was organized initially in Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil. So very much engaged in different struggles and creating this, as he says, intercultural exchange or intercultural translation between on the one hand, the international law framework and its language, and on the other hand, the struggles emanating from indigenous or different type of self-organization and resistance. So I think in the latest books I read from him, The Grammar of Time, which was republished in Portuguese a few years ago, he very much engages with all of them, and he polemicates with Walter Vignolo, etc. So I think this is absolutely core to the development of the epistemologies of the South. That would be my analysis, but maybe some people would discuss it in different way.
One more thing I was just wondering, because is that not clear to me actually, that why, like, it's kind of gotten momentum in Spanish and like Portuguese, area actually, the the epistemology of South. It didn't really influence much the Anglophonic world Why do you think so? Or like, do you think any reason behind it? Because their works have been translated already in English, but still, like, not that very influential in Anglophonic world. Why is that?
Yeah, that's true. I have no idea. I mean, it's probably, as we already mentioned, there's a form of hegemony of. I'm noticing it even in a very small field like museum studies, in which a lot of the knowledge produced by French, for example, thinkers who on museums and or the history of social museology that is important in the Iberian Peninsula is completely unknown in museum studies in England, for example. So I think there's a it's I don't know if
or
the
even in the
dynamics is the
case of
same.
art study, yeah.
Mm.
Yes.
But what is interesting in this case is that he had, I mean, not only Boaventura de Sousa Santos, but a lot of the researchers from the Center of Social Studies, they had positions in the University of Wisconsin because they have a Luso research department. And so they have been implemented, or at least they have an existence in the United States, in the academia in the United States. So why he's not more, I don't know. I mean, it probably has to do with the economy of knowledge production and the diffusion of knowledge as well in the Anglophone world. But this is truly a question to be investigated.
Anyone else got any question or any comments? Otherwise, formally, we can end the session actually and stop the live streaming, and then we can have an informal discussion actually for another like short period of time. So anyone else?
My last question to Joanna. So Joanna, how you will differentiate the epistemology of South, I think, from decoloniality? Do you want to do it?
Yeah, I tried to do it a little bit in my presentation. I think the way I understand it is that the decolonial approach that was born and developed within the 1990s in specifically Latin America, and that was looking, for instance, at, first of all, the date of 1492 and the great discoveries as the founding moment of Western modernity. And so the construction of Eurocentric knowledge and also the coloniality of power is a school that very much influenced the epistemologies of the South. But the epistemologies of the South is grounded in what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the knowledge born in struggle. So he's interested particularly in ways of resisting this Eurocentric coloniality of power, and the way these struggles of resistance have created their own knowledge, their own epistemologies. And he's interested mainly in that. But I agree with you that you can read, there's a lot of literature of debates. For instance, as I said, he had polemic with Walter Mignolo and with Henrique Dussel, in which they discuss, like in detail, the differences, the different of approaches. But because obviously the decolonial thinkers, they were also embedded and sometimes very much active in forms of resistance from Latin America. But I would say, yes, this idea of knowledge born in struggle is very much like central to the epistemologies of the South, whereas the modernity coloniality school looks at building also this genealogy of the coloniality of knowledge and the coloniality of power.
Sophia, but again, how I think from epistemology of South, you will define the idea of modernity. I think if you differentiate from decoloniality, so how will your focus or how will you interpret this modernity?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I'm not sure that I have an answer. I think my critique would be, from what I read, again, because I didn't read all of the books and articles of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, he developed some ideas which are very much borrowed from the decolonial school. You could say that he did a form of what he calls an intercultural translation. He translated it for a European audience, basically, in some ways, I think. But the idea of modernity sometimes seems to replace capitalism, but not in a clear way. And I would say that this ambivalence is sometimes a critique that I would address, Because then we already talked about the necessity of looking at political economy to organize struggle. When you speak about modernity, you make it a little bit more abstract. So I would say that when he speaks about modernity, he obviously is embedded in this genealogy that the modernity coloniality school has drawn, which is starting from the discoveries of America and building historical capitalism, but without mentioning necessarily modernity and capitalism as such. Even though now I'm contradicting a bit myself, he says that the three forms of domination within modernity are capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism. So basically, he has this triangle of domination within what he defines as modernity.
Yes, thank you. But the decolonial thinkers also use the triad.
So again, we will say it's a translation to not say something else.
That was a nice response. Anyone else like to go ahead? Any comments or questions? Otherwise, formally, you can end the session and stop streaming, and then we can have a informal discussion, actually. So it seems no one got any questions or comments. So thank you, Joanna, a lot, actually. It was really, really live discussion, actually. And in many ways, your response to the questions was really good.
Thank you.
Really great. And it was really helpful to us. And I think at some point, we will invite you, actually, to give a talk on basically museum and how basically to decolonize museum and other stuff, which is your area, to be precise, actually.
Yeah, it's more. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
thank you.
And,
I mean,
yeah,
I'm really thrilled, and it would be great to continue to do the participants generally speak English, or do you have mainly talks in other languages?
Well, largely it's in Bengali, actually, but some talks are actually in English. So it's a kind of a mixed series goes on. Yeah.
Yeah, I would be glad to just go if I have the possibility to join and listen when it's in English. That would be really great.
Oh, yeah, sure. There are two more discussions coming up, actually. One of which actually is on colonial, one of the new colonialism. It will be given by one of the professor from Dunedin University from the UK, Dunedin. And the following one actually will be given on secularism and I think and called I think is it secularism and I forgot what it's on the secularism actually, and it will be given by one of the scholar from the India actually. So
Wow.
there is an I'll send you the list actually for this season, and probably you'll be interested
Secularism
if you
and
have time. Actually, you can join with us.
pluralism.
Secularism and pluralism within the context of India. I suppose he'll be covering within the context of India. Yes, and yeah. So thanks a lot, actually. So formally, you can end the live streaming and discussion, actually. And thanks a lot, Jonathan.